He rode to Makkah. By Muhammad Asad. 6. Dreams, Section 1-3. 1. To be friend and guest of a great Arabian Amir means to be regarded and treated as friend and guest by all his officials, by his Rajajal, by the shopkeepers in his capital, and even by the Bedouins of the steppe under his authority. The guest can scarcely mention a wish without its being fulfilled at once. Whenever it can be fulfilled, from hour to hour he is overwhelmed by the warm, unquestioning graciousness which envelopes him in the marketplace of the town no less than in the wide halls and corridors of the castle. As so often before, this happens to me during the 2 days I stop at Hale. When I wish to drink coffee, the melodious sound of the brass mortar immediately rings out in my private reception room. When, in the morning, I casually mention to Zaid within the hearing of one of the Emir's servants a beautiful camel saddle I have just seen in the bazaar, it is brought to me in the afternoon and placed at my feet. Several times a day a gift arrives, a long robe of mango-patterned cashmere wool, or an embroidered kufiya, or a white Baghdad sheepskin for the saddle, or a curved Najdi dagger with a silver handle. And I, traveling very lightly, am unable to offer Ibn Musad anything in return except a large-scale English map of Arabia which, to his great delight, I have painstakingly marked with Arabic place names. Ibn Musad's generosity bears a strong resemblance to the ways of King Ibn Saud, which, after all, is not so surprising when one considers their close relationship. Not only are they cousins but they have also shared, ever since Ibn Saud was a young man and Ibn Musad still a boy, most of the difficulties, vicissitudes, and dreams of the king's early reign. And beyond that, their personal ties were cemented years ago by Ibn Saud's marriage to Jawhara, the sister of Ibn Musad, the woman who meant more to the king than any he married before or after her. Although many people have been admitted to his friendship, not many have been privileged to observe the most intimate, and perhaps the most significant, aspect of Ibn Saud's nature, his great capacity for love, which, had it been allowed to unfold and endure, might have led him to far greater heights than he has achieved. So much stress has been laid on the immense number of women he has married and divorced that many outsiders have come to regard him as something of a libertine engrossed in endless pursuit of physical pleasure. And few, if any, are aware that almost every one of Ibn Saud's marriages, apart from those alliances dictated by political considerations, was the outcome of a dim, insatiable desire to recapture the ghost of a lost love. Jawhara, the mother of his sons Muhammad and Khalid, was Ibn Saud's great love, and even now, after she has been dead for some 13 years, the king never speaks of her without a catch in his throat. She must have been an extraordinary woman, not merely beautiful, for Ibn Saud has known and possessed many beautiful women in his extremely exuberant marital career, but also endowed with that instinctive feminine wisdom which joins the rapture of the spirit to the rapture of the body. Ibn Saud does not often allow his emotions to become deeply involved in his relations with women, and this accounts perhaps for the ease with which he marries and divorces his wives. But with Jawhara he seems to have found a fulfillment that has never been repeated. Although even in her lifetime he had other wives, his real love was reserved to her as exclusively as if she had been his only wife. He used to write love poems to her. And once, in one of his more expansive moments, he told me, whenever the world was dark around me and I could not see my way out of the dangers and difficulties that beset me, I would sit down and compose an ode to Jawhara, and when it was finished, the world was suddenly lighted, and I knew what I had to do. But Jawhara died during the great influenza epidemic of 1919, which also claimed Ibn Saud's firstborn and most beloved son, Turkey, and this double loss left a never-healed scar on his life. It was not only to a wife and a son that he could give his heart so fully, he loved his father as few men love theirs. The father, Abdurrahman, whom I knew in my early years in Riyadh, was, though a kind and pious man, certainly not an outstanding personality like his son, and had not played a particularly spectacular role during his long life. Nevertheless, even after Ibn Saud had acquired a kingdom by his own effort and was undisputed ruler of the land, he behaved toward his father with such humility that he would never even consent to set foot in a room of the castle if Abdurrahman was in the room below, for, he would say, "How can I allow myself to walk over my father's head?" He would never sit down in the old man's presence without being expressly invited to do so. I still remember the discomfiture this kingly humility caused me one day at Riyadh. I think it was in December 1927. I was paying one of my customary visits to the king's father in his apartments in the royal castle. We were sitting on the ground on cushions, the old gentleman expatiating on one of his favorite religious themes. Suddenly an attendant entered the room and announced, "The Shuyukh is coming." In the next moment Ibn Saud stood in the doorway. Naturally, I wanted to rise. But old Abdurrahman gripped me by the wrist and pulled me down, as if to say, "Thou art my guest." I was embarrassed beyond words at thus having to remain seated while the king, after greeting his father from afar, was left standing in the doorway, obviously awaiting permission to enter the room, but he must have been accustomed to similar whimsies on his father's part, for he winked at me with a half-smile to put me at ease. Meanwhile, old Abdurrahman went on with his discourse, as if no interruption had occurred. After a few minutes he looked up, nodded to his son and said, "Step closer, oh my boy, and sit down." The king was at that time 47 or 48 years old. Some months later, we were at Mecca at the time, news was brought to the king that his father had died at Riyadh. I shall never forget the uncomprehending stare with which he looked for several seconds at the messenger, and the despair which slowly and visibly engulfed the features that were normally so serene and composed, and how he jumped up with a terrible roar, "My father is dead!" and, with great strides, ran out of the room, his abaya trailing on the ground behind him, and how he bounded up the stairway, past the awestruck faces of his men-at-arms, not knowing himself where he was going or why, shouting, "My father is dead! My father is dead!" For 2 days afterward he refused to see anyone, took neither food nor drink and spent day and night in prayer. How many sons of middle age, how many kings who had won themselves a kingdom through their own strength, would have thus mourned the passing of a father who had died the peaceful death of old age? 2. For it was entirely by his own efforts that Abdulaziz ibn Saud won his vast kingdom. When he was a child, his dynasty had already lost the last remnants of its power in Central Arabia and had been superseded by its one-time vassals, the dynasty of Ibn Rashid of Hale. Those were bitter days for Abdulaziz. The proud and reserved boy had to watch a foreign Amir governing his paternal city of Riyadh in the name of Ibn Rashid, for now, the family of Ibn Saud, once the rulers of almost all Arabia, were only pensioners of Ibn Rashid, tolerated and no longer feared by him. In the end, this became too much even for his peace-loving father, Abdurrahman, and he left Riyadh with his entire family, hoping to spend his remaining days in the house of his old friend, the ruler of Kuwait. But he did not know what the future held in store, for he did not know what was in his son's heart. Among all the members of the family there was only one who had any inkling of what was happening in this passionate heart, a younger sister of his father. I do not know much about her, I only know that whenever he dwells on the days of his youth, the king always mentions her with great reverence. She loved me, I think, even more than her own children. When we were alone, she would take me on her lap and tell me of the great things which I was to do when I grew up. "Thou must revive the glory of the house of Ibn Saud," she would tell me again and again, and her words were like a caress. But I want thee to know, O Aziz, she would say, that even the glory of the house of Ibn Saud must not be the end of thy endeavors. Thou must strive for the glory of Islam. Thy people sorely need a leader who will guide them onto the path of the Holy Prophet, and thou shalt be that leader. These words have always remained alive in my heart. Have they, really? Throughout his life Ibn Saud has loved to speak of Islam as a mission that had been entrusted to him. And even in later days, when it had long since become obvious that kingly power weighed more with him than his erstwhile championship of an ideal, his great eloquence has often succeeded in convincing many people, perhaps even himself, that this ideal was still his goal. Such childhood reminiscences were often brought up in the course of the intimate gatherings at Riyadh, which usually took place after the Isha prayer, about 2 hours after sunset. As soon as the prayer in the castle mosque was over, we would assemble around the king in one of the smaller rooms and listen to 1 hour's reading from the Prophet's traditions or from a commentary on the Quran. Afterward the king would invite 2 or 3 of us to accompany him to an inner chamber in his private quarters. One evening, I remember, while leaving the assembly in the wake of the king, I was once again struck by the majestic height with which he towered far above those who surrounded him. He must have caught my admiring glance, for he smiled briefly with that indescribable charm of his, took me by the hand and asked, "Why dost thou look at me like this, O Muhammad?" I was thinking, O long of age, that nobody could fail to recognize the king in thee when he sees thy head so far above the heads of the crowd. Ibn Saud laughed and, still leading me by the hand on his slow procession through the corridor, he said, "Yes, it is pleasant to be so tall. But there was a time when my tallness gave me nothing but heartache. That was years ago, when I was a boy and was living in the castle of Sheikh Mubarak at Kuwait. I was thin and extremely tall, much taller than my years would warrant, and the other boys in the castle, those of the Sheikh's family and even of my own, made me a target of their jokes, as if I were a freak. This caused me great distress, and sometimes I myself thought that I was truly a freak. I was so ashamed of my height that I would draw in my head and shoulders to make myself smaller when I walked through the rooms of the palace or over the streets of Kuwait. By then we had reached the king's apartments. His eldest son, Crown Prince Saud, was already waiting there for his father. He was about my own age and though not as tall as his father, quite imposing in appearance. His features were far more rugged than the king's and had none of the latter's mobility and vivacity. But he was a kind man and well thought of by the people. The king sat down on the cushions that were spread along the walls and motioned us all to follow suit. Then he commanded, "Kawa." The armed slave at the door immediately called out into the corridor, "Kawa." Whereupon this traditional call was taken up and repeated in rapid succession by other attendants down the entire length of the corridor, one after the other, "Kawa. Kawa." In a delightful ceremony of repetition, until it reached the king's coffee kitchen a few rooms away, and in a trice a golden daggered attendant appeared with the brass coffee pot in one hand and tiny cups in the other. The king received the first cup and the other cups were handed round to the guests in the order in which they were seated. On such informal occasions, Ibn Saud would talk freely of anything that occurred to him, about what was happening in distant parts of the world, about a strange new invention that had been brought to his notice, about people and customs and institutions, but above all, he liked to talk about his own experiences and would encourage others to participate in the conversation. On that particular evening, Amir Saud started the ball rolling when he laughingly turned to me. "Someone expressed a doubt to me today about thee, O Muhammad. He said that he was not at all sure whether thou art not an English spy in the guise of a Muslim. But don't worry, I was able to assure him that thou art indeed a Muslim." Unable to hold back a grin, I replied, that was very kind of thee, O Amir, may God lengthen thy life. But how couldst thou be so certain about this? Is it not that God alone knows what is in a man's heart? That is true, retorted Amir Saud, but in this case I have been given a special insight. A dream last week has given me this insight. I saw myself standing before a mosque and looking up at the minaret. Suddenly a man appeared on the gallery of the minaret, cupped his hands before his mouth and started the call to prayer, God is the greatest, God alone is great, and continued it to the end. There is no God but God, and when I looked closely, I saw that the man was thou. When I awoke, I knew with certainty, although I had never doubted it, that thou art truly a Muslim, for a dream in which God's name was extolled could not have been a deception. I was strongly moved by this unsolicited assertion of my sincerity by the king's son and by the earnest nod with which the king affirmed, as it were, Amir Saud's surprising narration. Taking up the thread, Ibn Saud remarked, it does often happen that God enlightens our hearts through dreams which sometimes foretell the future and sometimes make clear the present. Hast thou thyself never experienced such a dream, O Muhammad? Indeed, I have, O Imam, a long time ago, long before I ever thought of becoming a Muslim, before I even had set foot in a Muslim country. I must have been 19 years old or so at the time and lived in my father's house in Vienna. I was deeply interested in the science of man's inner life, which was the closest definition of psychoanalysis I could give the king, and was in the practice of keeping by my bedside paper and pencil in order to jot down my dreams at the moment of awakening. By doing so, I found, I was able to remember those dreams indefinitely, even if I did not keep them constantly in mind. In that particular dream, I found myself in Berlin, traveling in that underground railway they have there, with the train going sometimes through a tunnel below ground and sometimes over bridges high above the streets. The compartment was filled with a great throng of people, so many that there was no room to sit down and all stood tightly packed without being able to move, and there was only a dim light from a single electric bulb. After a while the train came out of the tunnel. It did not come onto one of those high bridges, but emerged instead onto a wide, desolate plain of clay, and the wheels of the train got stuck in the clay and the train stopped, unable to move forward or backward. All the travelers, and I among them, left the carriages and started looking about. The plain around us was endless and empty and barren, there was no bush on it, no house, not even a stone, and a great perplexity fell over the people's hearts. Now that we have been stranded here, how shall we find our way back to where other humans live? A great twilight lay over the immense plain, as at the time of early dawn. But somehow, I did not quite share the perplexity of the others. I made my way out of the throng and beheld, at a distance of perhaps 10 paces, a dromedary crouched on the ground. It was fully saddled, in exactly the way I later saw camels saddled in thy country, O Imam, and in the saddle sat a man dressed in a white and brown striped abaya with short sleeves. His kufiya was drawn over his face so that I could not discern his features. In my heart I knew at once that the dromedary was waiting for me, and that the motionless rider was to be my guide, and so, without a word, I swung myself onto the camel's back behind the saddle in the way a ratif, a pillion rider, rides in Arab lands. In the next instant, the dromedary rose and started forward in a long-drawn, easy gait, and I felt a nameless happiness rise within me. In that fast, smooth gait we traveled for what at first seemed to be hours, and then days, and then months, until I lost all count of time, and with every step of the dromedary my happiness rose higher, until I felt as if I were swimming through air. In the end, the horizon to our right began to redden under the rays of the sun that was about to rise. But on the horizon far ahead of us I saw another light. It came from behind a huge, open gateway resting on two pillars, a blinding white light, not red like the light of the rising sun to our right, a cool light that steadily grew in brightness as we approached and made the happiness within me grow beyond anything that words could describe. And as we came nearer and nearer to the gateway and its light, I heard a voice from somewhere announce, "This is the westernmost city." And I awoke. "Glory be unto God!" exclaimed Ibn Saud, when I had finished. "And did not this dream tell thee that thou wert destined for Islam?" I shook my head. "No, O long of age, how could I have known it? I had never thought of Islam and had never even known a Muslim." It was 7 years later, long after I had forgotten that dream, that I embraced Islam. I recalled it only recently when I found it among my papers, exactly as I had jotted it down that night upon awaking. "But it was truly thy fortune which God showed thee in that dream, O my son. Dost thou not recognize it clearly? The coming of the crowd of people, and thou with them, into a pathless waste, and their perplexity, is not that the condition of those whom the opening surah of the Quran describes as those who have gone astray? And the dromedary which, with its rider, was waiting for thee, was not this the right guidance of which the Quran speaks so often? And the rider who did not speak to thee and whose face thou couldst not see, who else could he have been but the Holy Prophet, upon whom be God's blessing and peace? He loved to wear a cloak with short sleeves. And do not many of our books tell us whenever he appears in dreams to non-Muslims or to those who are not yet Muslims, his face is always covered? And that white, cool light on the horizon ahead, what else could it have been but a promise of the light of faith which lights without burning? Thou didst not reach it in thy dream because, as thou hast told us, it was only years later that thou earnest to know Islam for the truth itself. Thou mayest be right, O long of age. But what about that westernmost city to which the gateway on the horizon was to lead me? For, after all, my acceptance of Islam did not lead me to the west, it led me, rather, away from the west. Ibn Saud was silent and thoughtful for a moment. Then he raised his head and, with that sweet smile which I had come to love, said, "Could it not have meant, O Muhammad, that thy reaching Islam would be the westernmost point in thy life and that after that, the life of the West would cease to be thine?" After a while the king spoke again, "Nobody knows the future but God. But sometimes he chooses to give us, through a dream, a glimpse of what is to befall us in the future. I myself have had such dreams twice or thrice, and they have always come true. One of them, indeed, has made me what I am. I was at that time 17 years old. We were living as exiles in Kuwait, but I could not bear the thought of the Ibn Rashids ruling over my homeland. Often would I beg my father, may God bestow his mercy upon him, fight, O my father, and drive the Ibn Rashids out. Nobody has a better claim to the throne of Riyadh than thou. But my father would brush aside my stormy demands as fantasies, and would remind me that Muhammad ibn Rashid was the most powerful ruler in the lands of the Arabs, and that he held sway over a kingdom that stretched from the Syrian desert in the north to the sands of the empty quarter in the south, and that all Bedouin tribes trembled before his iron fist. One night, however, I had a strange dream. I saw myself on horseback on a lonely steppe at night, and in front of me, also on horseback, was old Muhammad ibn Rashid, the usurper of my family's kingdom. We were both unarmed, but Ibn Rashid held aloft in his hand a great, shining lantern. When he saw me approach, he recognized the enemy in me and turned and spurred his horse to flight, but I raced after him, got hold of a comber of his cloak, and then of his arm, and then of the lantern, and I blew out the lantern. When I awoke, I knew with certainty that I was destined to wrest the rule from the house of Ibn-i-Rashid. In the year of that dream, 1897, Muhammad ibn-i-Rashid died. This seemed to Abdulaziz ibn-i Saud an opportune moment to strike, but Abdurrahman, his father, was not inclined to risk the peaceful life at Kuwait in so dubious an undertaking. But the son's passion was more stubborn than the father's inertia, and in the end the father gave in. With the assistance of his friend, Sheikh Mubarak of Kuwait, he raised a few Bedouin tribes that had remained faithful to his family, took the field against the Ibn Rashids in the old Arabian manner. With dromedaries and horses and tribal banners, was quickly routed by superior enemy forces and, in his innermost probably more relieved than disappointed, returned to Kuwait, resolved never again to disturb the evening of his life by warlike adventures. But the son did not give up so easily. He always remembered his dream of victory over Muhammad ibn-i-Rashid, and when his father renounced all claims to kingship over Najd, it was that dream which prompted young Abdulaziz to undertake his reckless bid for power. He got hold of a few friends, among them his cousins Abdullah ibn Jilawai and ibn-i Muzad, drummed together some venturesome Bedouins, until the whole company came to 40 men. They rode out of Kuwait like robbers, stealthily, without banners or drums or songs, and, avoiding the much frequented caravan routes and hiding in daytime, they reached the vicinity of Riyadh and made camp in a secluded valley. On the same day, Abd al-Aziz selected 5 companions out of the 40 and thus addressed the rest. We 6 have now placed our destinies in the hands of God. We are going to Riyadh, to conquer or to lose it for good. If you should hear sounds of fighting from the town, come to our assistance, but if you do not hear anything by sunset tomorrow, then you shall know that we are dead, and may God receive our souls. Should this happen, you others return secretly, as fast as you can, to Kuwait. And the 6 men set out on foot. At nightfall they reached the town and entered it through one of the breaches which years ago Muhammad ibn Rashid had made in the walls of the conquered city to humiliate its inhabitants. They went, their weapons hidden under their cloaks, straight to the house of the Rashidi Amir. It was locked, for the Amir, fearing the hostile populace, was accustomed to spend his nights in the citadel opposite. Abdulaziz and his companions knocked on the door, a slave opened it, only to be immediately overpowered, bound, and gagged. The same happened to the other inmates of the house, at that hour only a few slaves and women. The 6 adventurers helped themselves to some dates from the Emir's larder and passed the night reciting, by turns, from the Quran. In the morning the doors of the citadel were opened and the Amir stepped out, surrounded by armed bodyguards and slaves, crying, "O God, in thy hands is Ibn Saud." Abdulaziz and his 5 companions hurled themselves with their naked swords upon the surprised enemy. Abdullah ibn Jilawai threw his javelin at the Amir, but he ducked in time and the javelin stuck with quivering shaft in the mud wall of the citadel, there to be seen to this day. The Amir retreated in panic into the gateway, while Abdullah pursued him single-handedly into the interior of the citadel. Abd al-Aziz and his 4 remaining companions attacked the bodyguards, who, despite their numerical superiority, were too confused to defend themselves effectively. An instant later there appeared on the flat roof the Amir, hard pressed by Abdullah ibn Jilawai, begging for mercy, which was not granted, and when he fell down on the rampart of the roof and received the fatal sword stroke, Abdulaziz cried out from below, "Come, O men of Riyadh! Here am I, Abdulaziz, son of Abdurrahman of the house of Ibn-i Saud, your rightful ruler." And the men of Riyadh, who hated their northern oppressors, came running with their arms to the aid of their prince, and on their dromedaries galloped his 35 companions through the city gates, sweeping all opposition before them like a storm wind. Within 1 hour Abdulaziz ibn Saud was uncontested ruler of the city. That was in the year 1901. He was 21 years old. His youth came to a close, and he entered upon the second phase of his life, that of mature man and ruler. Step by step, province by province, Ibn Saud wrested Najd from the house of Ibn Rashid, pushing them back to their homeland, the Jabal Shamr, and its capital Hale. This expansion was as calculated as if it had been devised by a general staff working with maps, logistics, and geopolitical notions, although Ibn Saud had no general staff and had probably never laid eyes on a map. His conquests proceeded spirally, with Riyadh as their fixed center, and no forward step was ever taken until the previously conquered territory had been thoroughly subdued and consolidated. At first, he acquired the districts to the east and north of Riyadh, then he extended his realm over the western deserts. His northward progress was slow, for the Ibn Rashid still possessed considerable power and were, in addition, supported by the Turks, with whom they had formed a close alliance in the past decades. Ibn Saud was also hampered by his poverty. The southern regions of Najd could not provide him with sufficient revenue for supplying large groups of fighting men for any length of time. At one time, he once told me, I was so poor that I had to pawn the jewel-encrusted sword which Sheikh Mubarak had given me with a Jewish money lender at Kuwait. I could not even afford a carpet for my saddle, but the empty sacks that were placed under the sheepskin did as well. There was yet another problem which made Ibn Saud's early career a very hard one, the attitude of the Bedouin tribes. In spite of all its towns and villages, Central Arabia is primarily a land of Bedouins. It was their support or antagonism that decided the issues in the warfare between Ibn Saud and Ibn Rashid at almost every stage. They were fickle and changeable and usually joined whichever party seemed to be in the ascendant at the moment or offered the hope of greater spoils. A past master of such double-dealing was Faisal ad-Dawish, supreme chieftain of the powerful Mutayr tribe, whose allegiance could always tip the scales in favor of one or the other of the two rival dynasties. He would come to Hal to be loaded with gifts by Ibn Rashid. He would abandon Ibn Rashid and come to Riyadh to swear fealty to Ibn Saud, only to betray him a month later. He was faithless to all, brave and shrewd and obsessed by a tremendous greed for power, and many were the sleepless nights which he caused Ibn Saud. Beset by such difficulties, Ibn Saud conceived a plan, at first probably intended to be no more than a political maneuver but destined to develop into a grand idea capable of altering the face of the entire peninsula, the plan of settling the nomad tribes. It was obvious that, once having settled down, the Bedouins would have to give up their double game between the warring parties. Living as nomads, it was easy for them to fold their tents at a moment's notice and to move with their herds hither and thither, from one side to the other, but a settled mode of life would make this impossible, for a shifting of their allegiance to the enemy would bring with it the danger of losing Ijhir houses and plantations, and nothing is as dear to a Bedouin as his possessions. Ibn Saud made the settlement of Bedouins the most important point in his program. In this he was greatly assisted by the teachings of Islam, which always stressed the superiority of the settled over the nomadic way of life. The king sent out religious teachers who instructed the tribesmen in the faith and preached the new idea with unexpected success. The organization of the Ikhwan, brethren, as the settled Bedouins began to call themselves, took shape. The very first Ikhwan settlement was that of Alway Mutayr, the clan of ad-Dawish. Their settlement, Ardawiya, grew within a few years into a town of nearly 30,000 inhabitants. Many other tribes followed suit. The religious enthusiasm of the Ikhwan and their warlike potential became a powerful instrument in the hands of Ibn Saud. From then onward his wars assumed a new aspect borne by the religious fervor of the Ikhwan, They outgrew their erstwhile character of a dynastic struggle for power and became wars of faith. To the Ikhwan, at least, this rebirth of faith had more than a personal connotation. In their uncompromising adherence to the teachings of the great 18th century reformer, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, which aimed at a restoration of Islam to the austere purity of its beginnings and rejected all later innovations. The Ikhwan were, no doubt, often filled with an exaggerated sense of personal righteousness, but what most of them desired above all else was not merely personal righteousness but the establishment of a new society that could with justice be called Islamic. True. Many of their concepts were primitive and their ardor frequently bordered on fanaticism. But given proper guidance and education, their deep religious devotion might have enabled them to broaden their outlook and in time to become the nucleus of a genuine social and spiritual resurgence of all Arabia. Unfortunately, however, Ibn Saud failed to grasp the tremendous import of such a development and remained content with imparting to the Ikhwan only the barest rudiments of religious and secular education, in fact, only as much as seemed necessary to maintain their zealotic fervor. In other words, Ibn Saud saw in the Ikhwan movement only an instrument of power. In later years, this failure on his part was destined to recoil on his own policies and at one stage to endanger the very existence of the kingdom he had created, and it gave perhaps the earliest indication that he lacked that inner greatness which his people had come to expect of him. But the disillusionment of the Ikhwan with the king and the king's disillusionment with them was a long time in the making. In 1913, with the tremendous striking force of the Ikhwan at his disposal, Ibn Saud at last felt strong enough to attempt the conquest of the province of Al-Hassa on the Persian Gulf, which had once belonged to Najd but had been occupied by the Turks 50 years earlier. Warring against the Turks was no new experience to Ibn Saud. Off and on he had encountered Turkish detachments, especially field artillery, within the armies of Ibn Rashid. But an attack on Al-Hassa, which was directly administered by the Turks, was quite a different affair. It would bring him into head-on collision with a great power. But Ibn Saud had no choice. Unless he brought Al-Hassa and its ports under his control, he would always remain cut off from the outer world, unable to obtain sorely needed supplies of arms, ammunition, and many necessities of life. The need justified the risk, but the risk was so great that Ibn Saud hesitated long before undertaking an assault on Al-Hassa and its capital, Al-Hufyuf. To this day he is fond of recounting the circumstances in which the final decision was made. We were already in view of Al-Hufyuf. From the sand dune on which I was sitting I could clearly see the walls of the powerful citadel overlooking the town. My heart was heavy with indecision as I weighed the advantages and the dangers of this undertaking. I felt tired, I longed for peace and home, and with the thought of home, the face of my wife, Jahara, came before my eyes. I began to think of verses which I might tell her if she were by my side, and before I realized it, I was busy composing a poem to her, completely forgetting where I was and how grave a decision I had to make. As soon as the poem was ready in my mind I wrote it down. Sealed it. Called one of my couriers and commanded him. Take the 2 fastest dromedaries, ride to Riyadh without stopping and hand this over to Muhammad's mother. And as the courier was disappearing in a cloud of sand dust, I suddenly found that my mind had made a decision regarding the war. I would attack Al-Hufyuf, and God would lead me to victory. His confidence proved justified. In a daring assault, his warriors stormed the citadel, the Turkish troops surrendered and were permitted to withdraw with their arms and equipment to the coast, whence they embarked for Basra. The Ottoman government, however, was not prepared to yield its possessions so easily. A punitive expedition against Ibn Saud was decided upon at Istanbul. But before it could be undertaken, the Great War broke out, forcing the Turks to deploy all their military forces elsewhere, and with the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. Deprived of Turkish support and hemmed into the north by territories which were now administered by Britain and France, Ibn Rashid could no longer put up effective resistance. Led by Faisal ad-Dawish, now one of the most valiant paladins of Ibn Saud, the king's forces took Hale in 1921, and the house of Ibn Rashid lost its last stronghold. The climax of Ibn Saud's expansion came in 1924 to 1925, when he conquered the Hijaz, including Mecca, Medina, and Jeddah, and expelled the Sharifian dynasty which had come to power there after Sharif Hussein's British-supported revolt against the Turks in 1916. It was with the conquest of this holy land of Islam that Ibn Saud, now 45 years old, fully emerged into the view of the outer world. His unprecedented rise to power at a time when most of the Middle East had succumbed to Western penetration filled the Arab world with the hope that here at last was the leader who would lift the entire Arab nation out of its bondage. And many other Muslim groups besides the Arabs looked to him to bring about a revival of the Islamic idea in its fullest sense by establishing a state in which the spirit of the Quran would reign supreme. But these hopes remained unfulfilled. As his power increased and was consolidated, it became evident that Ibn Saud was no more than a king aiming no higher than so many other autocratic Eastern rulers before him. A good and just man in his personal affairs. Loyal to his friends and supporters and generous toward his enemies, graced by intellectual gifts far above the level of most of his followers, Ibn Saud has, nevertheless, not displayed that breadth of vision and inspired leadership which was expected of him. True. He has established a condition of public security in his vast domains unequaled in Arab lands since the time of the early caliphate 1,000 years ago. But, unlike those early caliphs, he accomplished this by means of harsh laws and punitive measures and not by inculcating in his people a sense of civic responsibility. He has sent a handful of young men abroad to study medicine and wireless telegraphy, but has done nothing to imbue his people as a whole with a desire for education and thus to lift them out of the ignorance in which they have been steeped for many centuries. He always speaks, with every outward sign of conviction, of the grandeur of the Islamic way of life, but he has done nothing to build up an equitable, progressive society in which that way of life could find its cultural expression. He is simple, modest, and hard-working, but at the same time, he indulges and allows those around him to indulge in the most extravagant and senseless luxuries. He is deeply religious and carries out to the letter every formal injunction of Islamic law, but he rarely seems to give any thought to the spiritual essence and purpose of those injunctions. He performs the 5 obligatory daily prayers with utmost regularity and spends long hours at night in deep devotion, but it never seems to have occurred to him that prayer is only a means and not an end in itself. He loves to speak of the responsibility of the ruler toward his subjects, and often quotes the Prophet's saying, "Every man is a shepherd entrusted with responsibility toward his flock," but, nevertheless, he has neglected the education of even his own sons and thus left them poorly equipped for the tasks that lie before them. And when he was once asked why he did not try to organize his state on a less personal basis, so that his sons might inherit an organized governmental structure, he answered, "I have conquered my kingdom with my own sword and by my own efforts, let my sons exert their own efforts after me." I recall a conversation with the king in which his improvidence and lack of administrative vision was fully demonstrated. It was in Mecca, late in 1928, when the famous leader of the Syrian independence movement, Amir Shakib Arslan, paid a visit to the king. Ibn Saud introduced me with the words, "This is Muhammad Asad, our son. He has just returned from the southern regions. He loves to travel among my Bedouins." Amir Shakib, who was not merely a political leader but a man of many-sided interests and a scholar of great erudition, was immediately curious to know my impressions when he learned that I was a European convert to Islam. I described to him some aspects of that journey to the south, and particularly my experiences in Wadi Bisha, which had never before been visited by a European. The great agricultural possibilities of that region, its wealth of water and its fertile soil had struck me as extremely promising, and in the course of my narrative, I turned to the king and said, "I am sure, O Imam, that Wadi Bisha could easily become a granary sufficient to supply the whole of the Hijaz with wheat, provided it were scientifically surveyed and developed." The king perked up his ears, for the imports of wheat for the province of Hijaz consumed much of the country's revenues, and shortage of revenues had always been Ibn Saud's greatest worry. "How long would it take," he asked me, "to develop Wadi Bisha in this way?" Not being an expert, I could not supply any clear-cut answer. I suggested that a commission of technical experts from abroad should survey the region and recommend concrete plans for its development. It would take, I ventured to say, at most about 5 to 10 years to make the area fully productive. 10 years! Exclaimed Ibn Saud. 10 years is a very long time. We Bedouins know only one thing: whatever we have in our hands we put into our mouths and eat. To plan for 10 years ahead is far too long for us. On hearing this astonishing statement, Amir Shakib stared at me, open-mouthed, as if disbelieving his own ears. And I could only stare back at him. It was then that I began to ask myself, is Ibn Saud a great man whom comfort and kingship have lured away from the path of greatness, or merely a man of great valor and shrewdness who never aspired to more than personal power? To this day, I cannot satisfactorily answer this question, for although I have known him for years, and known him well, a part of Ibn Saud's nature has remained inexplicable to me. Not that he is secretive in any way, he speaks freely about himself and often relates his experiences, but his character has too many facets to be easily grasped, and his outward appearance of simplicity conceals a heart as uneasy as the sea, and as rich in moods and inner contradictions. His personal authority is tremendous, but it does not rest so much on actual power as on the suggestive strength of his character. He is utterly unassuming in words and demeanor. His truly democratic spirit enables him to converse with the Bedouins who come to him in dirty, tattered garments as if he were one of them, and to allow them to call him by his first name, Abdulaziz. On the other hand, he can be haughty and contemptuous toward highly placed officials whenever he discerns servility in them. He despises all snobbery. I remember an incident in Mecca when, during a dinner at the royal palace, the head of one of Mecca's noblest families wrinkled his nose at the Bedouin crudity of some of the Najdis present who were gustily eating their rice in large fistfuls. In order to demonstrate his own refinement, the Meccan aristocrat daintily manipulated his food with his fingertips, when suddenly the voice of the king boomed out, "You fine people toy with your food so gingerly, is it because you are accustomed to dig with your fingers in dirt? We people of Najd are not afraid of our hands, they are clean, and therefore we eat heartily and by the handful." Sometimes, when he is entirely relaxed, a gentle smile plays about Ibn Saud's mouth and gives an almost spiritual quality to the beauty of his face. I am sure that were music not regarded as reprehensible by the strict Wahhabi code which Ibn Saud follows, he would undoubtedly have expressed himself in it. But as it is, he shows his musical bent only in his little poems, his colorful descriptions of experiences, and his songs of war and love which have spread through the whole of Najd and are sung by men as they ride on their dromedaries across the desert and women in the seclusion of their chambers. And it reveals itself in the way his daily life follows a regular, elastic rhythm suited to the demands of his royal office. Like Julius Caesar, he possesses to a high degree the capacity to pursue several trains of thought at one and the same time, without in the least curtailing the intensity with which he attacks each individual problem. And it is this remarkable gift which permits him to direct personally all the affairs of his vast kingdom without falling into confusion or breaking down from overwork, and still find time and inclination to cultivate so lavishly the society of women. The acuteness of his perceptions is often uncanny. He has an almost unfailing, instinctive insight into the motives of the people with whom he has to deal. Not infrequently, as I myself have had opportunity to witness, he is able to read men's thoughts before they are spoken, and seems to sense a man's attitude toward him at the very moment of that man's entering the room. It is this ability which has made it possible for Ibn Saud to thwart several exceedingly well-prepared attempts on his life, and to make many a lucky on-the-spot decision in political matters. In short, Ibn Saud seems to possess many of the qualities which could make a man great, but he has never made a real attempt to achieve greatness. Not being introspective by temperament, he has a tremendous talent for rationalization, for persuading himself of his own righteousness in the face of the most glaring lapses, and easily evades all self-examination. Those who surround him, his courtiers and the innumerable hangers-on who live off his bounty, certainly do nothing to counteract this unfortunate tendency. Belying the tremendous promise of his younger years, when he appeared to be a dreamer of stirring dreams, he has broken, perhaps without realizing it himself, the spirit of a high-strung nation that had been wont to look up to him as to a God-sent leader. They had expected too much of him to bear the disappointment of their expectations with equanimity, and some of the best among the people of Najd now speak in bitter terms of what they consider a betrayal of their trust. I shall never forget the look of misery and hopelessness in the face of a Najdi friend, a man who had once been a most ardent believer in Ibn Saud's leadership and had followed him through thick and thin in the most difficult years of his royal career, when, speaking of the king, he told me one day, when we rode with Ibn Saud against Ibn Rashid in those early days, and when we rode with him under banners inscribed La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, against that traitor to Islam, Sharif Hussain, we thought that Ibn Saud was a new Moses, destined to lead his people out of the bondage of ignorance and decay into the promised land of Islam. But when he settled down to his newly won comforts and luxuries, forgetting his people and their future, we found to our horror that he was Pharaoh. My friend was, of course, far too harsh and even unjust in his condemnation of Ibn Saud, for he is no Pharaoh, no oppressor, he is a kind man, and I have no doubt that he loves his people. But he is no Moses, either. His failure lies rather in his having failed to be as great as the people had thought him to be, and as, perhaps, he could have been had he followed the trumpet call of his youth. He is an eagle who never really took wing. He has simply remained a benevolent tribal chieftain on an immensely enlarged scale. 3. On the morning of my departure from Hale, I am awakened by a loud music which flows in through the open window of my castle chamber. A singing, chirping and strumming, like 100 violins and wind instruments being tuned before the opening of a grand opera performance, that disjointed polyphony of short, discordant strokes which, because they are so many and so subdued, seem to chum up a mysterious, almost ghostly unity of tone. But this must indeed be a huge orchestra, so mighty are the waves of sound it sends forth. As I step to the window and look out into the dawning grey of the morning, over and beyond the empty marketplace, beyond the mud-grey houses of the town, toward the foothills where the tamarisks and the palm orchards grow, I recognize it. It is the music of the drawwells in the orchards which are just beginning their day's work, hundreds of them. In large leather bags the water is being drawn up by camels. The drawropes run over crudely fashioned wooden pulleys, and each pulley rubs against its wooden axle and sings. Pipes, creaks and soughs in a multitude of high and low tones until the rope is fully unrolled and the pulley comes to a standstill. Whereupon it gives out a violent sound like a shout. And the shout gradually fades away in sighing chords, now powerfully accompanied by the rush of water into wooden troughs, and then the camel turns round and goes slowly back to the well, and again the pulley makes music while the ropes roll over it and the waterskin sinks down into the well. Because there are so many wells, the singing does not stop for a single moment, the tones now meet in accords, now separate, some of them begin with new jubilation while others die away. Whole cascades of ungraspable rhythms flow together and away from each other, roaring, creaking, piping, singing. What a magnificent orchestra! It is not coordinated by human design, and therefore, it almost reaches the greatness of nature, whose will is impenetrable.